September 26, 1983. Serpukhov 15 bunker, 100 kilometers south of Moscow. 12:14 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stared at the red warning lights flashing across his console. The computer system was screaming at him. Missile launch detected. Then another, and another. 5 Minuteman ICBMs, the system calculated, launched from American soil and headed directly for the Soviet Union. Flight time, less than 30 minutes. The protocol was clear. Petrov's job wasn't to think, it was to report. Report immediately to Soviet High Command, who would then have perhaps 8 minutes to authorize a retaliatory strike before American warheads vaporized Moscow, Leningrad, and every major Soviet city. 8 minutes to decide whether to end human civilization. Petrov's hand hovered over the phone. Around him, his crew waited for the order they drilled for 1,000 times. The sirens wailed. The computers showed launch confidence high. But something gnawed at him. Why only 5 missiles? If the Americans were launching a first strike, wouldn't they launch everything? He later told interviewers, "I had a funny feeling in my gut." That funny feeling, not protocol, not technology, not orders, is the only reason you're reading this sentence today. What you're about to discover is that Petrov's moment wasn't unique. It was just one of at least 10 times during the Cold War when the world stood at the edge of nuclear oblivion and survived only through luck, individual judgment, or sheer accident. These weren't theoretical scenarios or distant possibilities. These were moments when the missiles were primed, the orders were given, or the misunderstandings were complete. Moments when the systems designed to prevent nuclear war nearly caused it instead. The truly terrifying part? Most of these incidents remained classified for decades. We almost died without ever knowing how close we came. The confidence of systems. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers operated under a dangerous assumption that nuclear war could be controlled, managed, prevented through technology and rational decision-making. President Eisenhower spoke confidently in 1954 about massive retaliation, the idea that clear deterrence would prevent any hot conflict. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev declared that the capitalists will never dare strike first because they know we will annihilate them. Both were catastrophically wrong, but not in the way they expected. The danger wasn't intentional aggression, it was mistakes. By the 1960s, the American Early Warning System, a network of radar stations, satellite systems, and underground command centers, was considered state-of-the-art. General Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command, boasted that his systems could detect a flock of geese at 200 miles. The Soviets, meanwhile, invested billions in their own warning networks, convinced that technology could give them the precious minutes needed to respond to American aggression. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told President Kennedy in 1961, "Our systems are designed with multiple redundancies. The chances of a false alarm triggering retaliation are infinitesimally small." McNamara believed in what he called rational deterrence, the idea that as long as both sides understood the mathematics of mutually assured destruction, nuclear war would remain impossible. The CIA's national intelligence estimates from the early 1960s repeatedly emphasized Soviet rationality. One 1962 assessment stated, "Soviet leadership, while ideologically committed to communism's eventual triumph, will not risk national survival through nuclear confrontation." American war planners operated under the belief that clear communication channels, sophisticated technology, and rational actors on both sides created an imperfect but functional system of crisis management. The Soviets held similar illusions. KGB documents from the period reveal a belief that their intelligence networks would provide adequate warning of American attack preparations. A classified GRU assessment from 1961 concluded, Capitalist aggression will be preceded by observable military preparations, giving us sufficient time to adopt defensive postures. Both sides were building their strategies on fundamentally flawed assumptions. That technology would work perfectly, that humans would interpret data correctly under extreme stress, that communication would remain clear during crisis, and that accidents were preventable through careful planning. The early warning problem. By 1980, the United States maintained a nuclear arsenal of 24,000 warheads. The Soviet Union possessed 30,000. The strategic doctrine on both sides emphasized launch on warning, the ability to detect an incoming attack and launch a counterstrike before your own missiles were destroyed in their silos. This created an impossible paradox. To be credible, the response time had to be measured in minutes. But in minutes, there was no time to verify whether the warning was real. President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, received the famous football, the briefcase containing nuclear launch codes, with instructions that, in the event of confirmed attack, he would have approximately 6 minutes to wake the president, brief him on the situation, and receive authorization for retaliation. 6 minutes to decide the fate of human civilization. What nobody fully acknowledged, at least not publicly, was how often the systems malfunctioned, how often human judgment became the last, thin line between civilization and extinction. The architecture of apocalypse. The infrastructure for nuclear war emerged gradually, almost thoughtlessly, as each superpower responded to the other's capabilities. By 1960, the United States had constructed a vast network of early warning systems. The Distant Early Warning (DW) line across the Arctic, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System (BMEWs), with massive radar installations in Greenland, Alaska, and England, and increasingly sophisticated satellite systems designed to detect the infrared signature of missile launches. The Soviets built parallel systems. Their early warning network, codenamed OKO, used satellites in highly elliptical orbits to monitor American missile fields. Ground-based radars at sites like Serpukhov 15 provided redundancy. By the late 1970s, both sides had created what defense analysts called the network, an interconnected system of sensors, computers, and command centers theoretically capable of detecting an attack within 90 seconds and enabling retaliation within 15 minutes. But these systems had a fundamental flaw. They were designed by humans, operated by humans, and relied on human judgment during the most stressful moments imaginable. The false alarm problem emerges. The first major false alarm occurred on October 5, 1960, when BMEW's radars in Thule, Greenland detected what appeared to be a massive Soviet missile attack. The reading showed 99.9% probability of attack. The Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. General Thomas Power, LeMay's successor, later described the moment. For approximately 10 minutes, we believed we were under attack. What saved the world? Someone noticed the radar returns were tracking the moon rising over Norway. The system had mistaken the moon for incoming missiles. This wasn't the last time. On November 9, 1965, a simple power failure at NORAD headquarters cut communication links to several early warning stations. Standard protocol interpreted lost communication as potential attack. For 12 minutes, American nuclear forces prepared for war until engineers restored power and revealed the truth. There was no attack, just a blown circuit breaker. These incidents received minimal publicity. The Pentagon's position, stated in a 1966 classified review, was that public knowledge of system vulnerabilities would undermine deterrence credibility and potentially embolden Soviet aggression. Human factors under extreme pressure. By the 1970s, Pentagon psychologists began studying what they called the decision-making problem. how humans behaved when given minutes to make choices with existential consequences. The results were deeply troubling. Simulation exercises revealed that experienced officers, when faced with ambiguous data and extreme time pressure, often made drastically different decisions. Some became paralyzed by the magnitude of responsibility. Others became aggressive, interpreting any uncertainty as enemy action. A 1975 RAND Corporation study concluded, human judgment under nuclear crisis conditions is fundamentally unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The Soviets faced identical problems. KGB psychological profiles of officers assigned to nuclear command positions emphasized ideological steadfastness and party loyalty. But these qualities proved irrelevant when staring at flashing red lights that might indicate the end of the world. Neither side wanted to acknowledge the terrifying truth. The most dangerous component of their nuclear arsenals wasn't the missiles. It was the seconds to decide doctrine that put ultimate power in the hands of exhausted, stressed humans, working with imperfect technology. The moon over Norway, 1960. That October morning in Thule, officers at BMEWS watched their screens show massive Soviet launches. The system calculated 100-plus missiles inbound. Colonel William Penfold, the duty officer, recalled, "Everything we'd trained for was happening. The board showed red. The probability assessment showed 99.9%. Protocol demanded immediate escalation. But Khrushchev was in New York at the UN. Would the Soviets really launch while their premier was on American soil?" Penfold held off for 90 seconds, an eternity in nuclear time, while technicians scrambled for verification. The signature was tracking at 4,000 mph, consistent with ICBMs. But the trajectory was wrong, slightly wrong. Someone said, "That's where the moon is," Penfold later testified. "We were tracking the goddamn moon." The bear that almost started the World War III, 1962, October 25, 1962, Duluth Air Force Base, 11:30 p.m. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, already the tensest moment in human history, a guard at a Minnesota air base spotted an intruder climbing the security fence. He shot at the figure and triggered the sabotage alarm. The alert automatically transmitted to neighboring bases, including Volk Field in Wisconsin. Except Volk Field's alarm system was incorrectly wired. The sabotage signal activated the nuclear klaxon, the alarm that meant imminent nuclear war. Within 90 seconds, F-106A fighters equipped with nuclear air-to-air missiles were taxiing toward the runway, their pilots believing World War III had begun. A Volk Field officer, realizing something was wrong, drove his car onto the runway and blocked the fighters from taking off, with his headlights having no other way to signal them. The intruder in Duluth? A black bear. Captain John Bassinger, one of the pilots, stated in a 2012 interview, "We were armed with nuclear weapons and believed we were responding to Soviet sabotage. If we'd gotten airborne, we would have flown toward Soviet airspace looking for targets." During the Cuban Missile Crisis, think about that. The training tape, 1979, November 9th, 1979. NORAD Command Center, Colorado, 8:50 a.m. Computer screens at NORAD suddenly showed a massive Soviet attack. 200-plus ICBMs launched from submarine and land positions. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski received the call moments later. "Mr. Brzezinski, we have high confidence of Soviet attack. Impact in 10 to 12 minutes." Brzezinski was seconds from calling President Carter to recommend immediate retaliation when a second call came. "Stand down. False alarm. Unknown cause." The cause? A technician had loaded a training simulation tape into the live warning system. For 6 minutes, America's nuclear command structure believed it was responding to actual attack, while actually watching a training scenario. 10 officers at different command stations saw the same attack data. All interpreted it as real. General David Jones, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, later said, "We came very, very close to launching. If the scenario had been slightly more ambiguous, if confirmation calls had been delayed by another minute or two, I'm not confident we would have stopped the response." The 46-cent chip, 1980, June 3, 1980. NORAD Command Center, 2:26 m. Once again, NORAD screens showed Soviet missiles inbound, this time 220 submarine-launched warheads. NORAD notified SAC, which prepared B-52 bombers for launch. National Emergency Airborne Command Posts, the Doomsday planes, took off from Andrews Air Force Base to ensure command continuity during nuclear war. Pacific Command prepared missile submarines for launch. 3 minutes into the crisis, a satellite check showed no launches. Missiles on high alert stood down. Post-crisis analysis revealed the cause. A single failed computer chip worth 46 cents had generated random attack data that perfectly mimicked an actual Soviet strike. The same chip failed 3 days later, on June 6th, creating an identical false alarm. This time, officers recognized the pattern faster, but only because they'd just experienced it. NORAD Commander General James Hardinger testified to Congress, "The Soviet Union could have interpreted our bomber launches and emergency aircraft deployment as preparation for American first strike. They had similar warning systems with similar flaws. If their chip had failed at the same moment, we might have had reciprocal false alarms, with each side interpreting the other's defensive preparations as offensive action." Petrov's Choice, 1983. September 26, 1983. Serpukhov 15. 12:14 a.m. We returned to Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer staring at his flashing console. But now the full context becomes clear. This incident occurred during Operation Ryan, a KGB intelligence program based on the paranoid belief that Reagan planned an imminent nuclear first strike. Soviet leadership was genuinely convinced war was coming. Petrov's computer showed 5 American missiles launched. Launch confidence high. Protocol demanded immediate reporting to Soviet High Command. But Petrov reasoned, if the Americans attack, they use everything. Not 5 missiles, thousands. He reported a system malfunction. He was correct. Satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile exhaust. But Petrov didn't know that for 23 minutes. For 23 minutes, he alone decided that his judgment superseded his technology, his orders, and his training. He later said, "I didn't want to be the man who started World War III because of a computer error." Soviet records show Petrov was reprimanded, not honored, for his decision. His superiors believed he'd violated protocol. They were right. Protocol would have killed everyone. Able Archer 83, November 1983, November 2, 11, 1983. NATO headquarters, multiple locations. Just 6 weeks after Petrov's incident, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command post exercise simulating nuclear war from conventional conflict through nuclear release. The exercise used new encrypted communication formats and involved personnel with actual nuclear release authority, creating unprecedented realism. What NATO didn't realize: the KGB interpreted Able Archer as potential cover for actual attack. Soviet intelligence detected NATO airborne command posts flying unusual patterns, communications changes suggesting wartime protocols, and movements of nuclear weapons in Europe. On November 8-9, Soviet nuclear forces went to heightened alert. SS-20 missiles in East Germany were prepared for launch. Soviet submarines moved into attack positions. In retrospect, the Soviet Union came closer to launching preemptive strikes during Able Archer than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. KGB Colonel Oleg Gordievsky, who later defected, reported, "The danger was not that the Soviets would deliberately attack. but that they would misinterpret the exercise as actual war preparation and strike preemptively in self-defense. President Reagan, stunned when finally briefed on Soviet perceptions, wrote in his diary, "I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing anything like that." The Norwegian scientific rocket, 1995, January 25, 1995. Russian Early Warning Center, 7 to 16 p.m. 10 years after the Cold War supposedly ended, Norwegian scientists launched a scientific rocket to study the aurora borealis. They had properly notified 30 countries, including Russia. The notification never reached Russian radar operators. The rocket's trajectory, briefly, matched the profile of an American Trident submarine missile launched from the Norwegian Sea. For the first time in history, Russian President Boris Yeltsin activated the nuclear briefcase. He had 8 minutes to decide whether to launch. Yeltsin's aide later described the scene. The president opened the briefcase. The communications channels were active. Everyone was waiting for his order. For 4 minutes, Yeltsin and his military chiefs debated whether they were under attack. Only as the rocket passed its apogee, heading back down rather than continuing toward Russia, did they realize it wasn't a weapon. Yeltsin closed the briefcase. He came closer to actually authorizing launch than any Soviet or Russian leader in history, including during Cuba. The solar storm of 1967, May 23, 1967. NORAD headquarters, 10:15 a.m. Early warning radars across the northern United States went completely dead, all of them, simultaneously. NORAD analysts concluded this could only mean one thing: Soviet jamming in preparation for attack. American nuclear bombers began scrambling. Within minutes, B-52s loaded with thermonuclear weapons were taxiing for takeoff, preparing to cross into Soviet airspace before their bases were destroyed. At Thule Air Base, a young astronomer named Colonel Delmar Wyant intervened. He'd been tracking a massive solar flare and realized the timing matched exactly. He convinced commanders that the Soviets hadn't jammed the radars. The sun had overwhelmed them with electromagnetic radiation. The bombers were recalled, but they'd been 15 minutes from reaching points of no return. Once beyond those points, they would have continued toward Soviet targets, unable to receive recall orders due to the same solar interference that had started the crisis. The Arkansas Titan II explosion, 1980, September 18th to the 19th, 1980. Damascus, Arkansas. Launch Complex 374-7. This near disaster was different. Not a false alarm, but a real accident that could have caused exactly what all the detection systems feared: an actual nuclear detonation on American soil that the Soviets might interpret as a first strike gone wrong. During routine maintenance, an Air Force repairman dropped a socket wrench. It fell 70 feet, punctured a Titan II missile's fuel tank, and caused a massive fuel leak. For 8 hours, fuel vapor built up in the underground silo containing a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead, the largest in the American arsenal, 600 times more powerful than Hiroshima. At 3 a.m. on September 19th, the vapor exploded. The blast ejected the 740-ton missile door and threw the 9-megaton warhead 600 feet from the silo. 21 personnel were injured. 1 died. The warhead didn't detonate, but it could have. Air Force Senior Airman David Livingston, who was there, later stated, "We were incredibly lucky. A warhead that size detonating in Arkansas would have been visible to Soviet satellites. Their protocol would assume we'd lost control of our arsenal. In the middle of Cold War tensions, that could have been interpreted as the breakdown they'd been waiting for, the chance to strike first while we were vulnerable." The Black Sea Bumping Incident, 1988. February 12, 1988. Black Sea, international waters. Soviet warships deliberately rammed the USS Yorktown and USS Karen, American vessels conducting freedom of navigation exercises in disputed waters. The collision was intentional. A Soviet frigate struck the Yorktown's hull, causing visible damage. What made this terrifying wasn't the ramming itself, but the timing and context. Both American ships were Aegis-equipped cruisers carrying nuclear Tomahawk cruise missiles. Standard American doctrine authorized nuclear release authority to ship commanders if communication with higher command was lost. During the ramming, communications were temporarily disrupted. For approximately 15 minutes, the Yorktown's captain had both authorization to use nuclear weapons and reason to believe his ship was under deliberate attack by Soviet forces, while unable to confirm whether broader hostilities had begun. Captain Richard Rohrbach later testified, "We were carrying weapons that could have destroyed Sevastopol. We'd been deliberately struck by Soviet ships. Communications were down. The Cold War rules of engagement put nuclear decisions in my hands during communications blackout. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life." The Soviets apparently never realized how close they'd come to triggering nuclear response. They thought they were making a political point about territorial waters. They were actually brushing against nuclear catastrophe. American responses, technology and protocol. The false alarms of 1979-1980 triggered comprehensive reviews of American nuclear command systems. The Defense Nuclear Agency's 1981 report identified 3,703 routine system alerts over 18 months, an average of 7 per day. Of these, 152 required initial evaluation for possible attack. 147 required more detailed investigation. 4 progressed to the point where NORAD duty officers briefed senior commanders on possible war. Congress responded with the Nuclear Command and Control System, NSC, Improvement Program, allocating $3 billion to upgrade sensors, improve computer systems, and build redundancy into warning networks. The Air Force replaced the entire computer infrastructure at NORAD, installing new processors that could cross-check satellite data against radar returns within seconds rather than minutes. More importantly, protocols changed. The new two-man rule required independent confirmation from multiple sensor systems before any attack assessment could progress to presidential notification. General Benny Davis, SAC commander from 1981 to 1985, implemented what he called structured skepticism. "We trained our people that their first assumption should be that any alarm is false until proven otherwise. That's backwards from how we'd done it. But the false alarm rate made it necessary." The Pentagon also expanded the secure conference call system that allowed the President, Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs, and NORAD commander to communicate simultaneously during crises. Response times expanded from 6 minutes to 12. Still terrifyingly brief, but double the previous window for decision-making. Soviet counter-adaptations. Soviet responses followed different patterns. The KGB's Ryan program, initiated in 1981, tasked intelligence operatives worldwide with detecting signs of American nuclear attack preparation. Agents monitored everything from blood bank supplies, which might increase before war, to lights burning late in Western government buildings, to pizza deliveries at the Pentagon. The program reflected genuine Soviet paranoia, but it also created new dangers. With thousands of agents primed to interpret routine events as war preparation, the risk of misinterpretation multiplied. A classified KGB assessment from 1984, revealed after the Cold War, showed agents reporting signs of imminent attack at least 22 times during 1983-84, all false. After Able Archer 83, however, Soviet leadership began to recognize that their own fear might trigger the war they dreaded. General Secretary Gorbachev, taking power in 1985, ordered a comprehensive review of nuclear protocols. The resulting changes included extending decision timelines, requiring confirmation from multiple sources, and importantly, opening direct communication channels with Washington beyond the limited hotline. Soviet Marshal Sergei Akhromeyev later wrote, "We realized that our systems designed to protect us could kill us." The false alarm problem wasn't uniquely American. We had identical dangers in our systems. Worse, we'd created a situation where both sides were so nervous that a technical failure could trigger the very war we were trying to prevent. The hotline expansion. The original Moscow-Washington hotline, established after Cuba in 1963, was a teletype machine. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Nixon placed American forces on DEFCON 3 in response to Soviet movements in the Middle East, the teletype proved inadequate for rapid crisis communication. By 1988, the hotline had evolved into a sophisticated network. Secure voice links, fax capabilities, and most importantly, direct connections between nuclear command centers beyond just Washington and Moscow. During the 1988 Black Sea incident, American commanders used these expanded channels to rapidly communicate with Soviet counterparts, explaining that the American ships had not initiated hostilities and weren't escalating. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stated, "Without those direct military-to-military communications, the Black Sea incident could have spiraled. The Soviets would have interpreted our defensive posturing as offensive preparation. We'd have interpreted their response as escalation. The expanded hotline gave us minutes to explain intentions, minutes we wouldn't have had in 1983. The psychological toll. What remained largely hidden was the psychological impact on the officers manning these systems. Post-Cold War interviews revealed epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and substance abuse among personnel in nuclear command positions. Major Bruce Blair, who served as a Minuteman missile launch officer, later described the mental strain. "You're 22 years old, sitting in an underground capsule with another 22-year-old, holding keys that can end human civilization. You run drills where you practice turning those keys. But you also know that every alarm might be the real one. Every red light might be the moment you become responsible for billions of deaths." Some of my colleagues broke down. Others turned to alcohol. A few became dangerously convinced that nuclear war was inevitable, which made them more likely to interpret ambiguous data as attack. Soviet officers faced identical pressures, compounded by authoritarian systems that punished independent judgment. Petrov's reprimand for trusting his gut over his computer was typical. The Soviet system rewarded obedience, but survival had repeatedly required disobedience. If we must identify the single closest approach to accidental nuclear war, it wasn't during a superpower crisis. It was during the Norwegian rocket incident of January 25, 1995. The moment Yeltsin's briefcase opens. At 7:16 p.m. Moscow time, President Boris Yeltsin stood in his Kremlin office with a nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, open before him. Around him, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev and Chief of Staff Mikhail Kolesnikov debated whether the radar signature represented an attack. Yeltsin later described the scene in his memoirs. For the first time in the nuclear age, the Cheget was activated for real. Not a drill, not a test, a real authorization moment. I had 8 minutes to decide whether millions of people would live or die. I had my hand on the communication system that would send the launch orders. The Kazbek nuclear command system was fully active. Missile submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic were standing by for launch codes. Land-based ICBMs were in heightened readiness. For 4 minutes, 240 seconds, Russian nuclear forces were in the exact posture required for immediate launch. At 7:20 p.m., the rocket passed apogee and began its descent trajectory, clearly heading back toward Earth rather than continuing toward Russian territory. Yeltsin closed the briefcase. The system stood down. What makes this the most dangerous moment is that all the safety systems that prevented earlier close calls were absent. There was no technical failure to diagnose, no time to investigate sources, no conflicting sensor data to analyze. The Norwegian rocket's trajectory legitimately matched an attack profile during its boost phase. The Russian decision-making system functioned exactly as designed. It detected what appeared to be an attack and prepared immediate response. The only thing that prevented launch was that the rocket's trajectory naturally diverged from an attack profile. Because it wasn't an attack. Had the rocket's scientific mission required even a slightly different trajectory, or had Russian leaders been marginally more paranoid, the response might have been different. Impact of accumulated near misses. By the mid-1990s, declassification of Cold War incidents revealed to the public just how close the world had repeatedly come to destruction. The revelations fundamentally changed public understanding of nuclear deterrence. The comforting Cold War narrative that rational leaders on both sides maintained careful control collapsed. In its place emerged a terrifying reality. Survival had depended on luck, individual courage, and technical accidents happening to reveal themselves before irrevocable decisions were made. Former Defense Secretary William Perry stated in 2015, "We escaped the Cold War without a nuclear war not through skill, strategy, or rational deterrence, but through sheer dumb luck. We played Russian roulette with the fate of civilization, and we happened to survive. That doesn't mean the strategy worked. It means we were extraordinarily fortunate." The accumulated close calls drove policy changes that would have seemed impossible during the Cold War itself. The 1991 Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-Wasserstorm, reduced deployed strategic weapons by 80%. Both sides agreed to de-alert thousands of warheads, extending launch timelines from minutes to hours or days. The Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program helped secure former Soviet nuclear materials, reducing the risk of accidental detonation during the chaotic Soviet collapse. Most significantly, both Russia and America moved away from launch on warning doctrines. Modern nuclear strategy still maintains deterrence, but without the hair-trigger postures that made every false alarm a potential civilization ender. We survived the Cold War's close calls, but the lessons remain urgently relevant. Every incident revealed the same fundamental problem. The combination of nuclear weapons, early warning systems, and seconds to decide timelines created a situation where technological failure, human error, or simple bad luck could trigger consequences far beyond any rational intention. The false alarms weren't failures of particular systems or individual officers. They were inherent properties of the strategic situation. When you build weapons that must be launched within minutes to be credible deterrents, you inevitably create systems where there isn't time to verify whether threats are real. When you face adversaries you deeply mistrust, you inevitably interpret ambiguous data as hostile intention. When you put exhausted humans in positions of ultimate responsibility, you inevitably get inconsistent judgment. Stanislav Petrov, the man whose funny feelings saved the world, died in 2017, largely unknown and unheralded. His superiors had been correct that he violated protocol. In doing so, he demonstrated that the protocol was fundamentally flawed. The Norwegian rocket incident of 1995 proved that the danger didn't end with the Cold War. As long as nuclear weapons exist on rapid launch postures, the potential for catastrophic mistakes persists. Today's nuclear-armed states, including newer powers like Pakistan and India, face identical challenges with warning systems, decision timelines, and human judgment under pressure. Post-Cold War analysis suggests we experienced between 10 to 15 incidents where accidental nuclear war came close enough to require individual human judgment overriding systems or protocols. We know about 10 of them. Others likely remain classified. The ones we know about share a chilling characteristic. In each case, the correct decision according to protocol, technology, or strategic doctrine would have been the wrong decision. Former Soviet Colonel Valery Yerenik, who helped design Soviet nuclear command systems, stated shortly before his death, "We built a machine for ensuring our survival. We succeeded, barely. But we also built a machine that almost killed everyone multiple times. The most terrifying thing? Both sides built the same machine, and neither fully understood what we'd created until we almost died." The ultimate legacy of the Cold War close calls isn't that nuclear deterrence worked. It's that it almost failed, repeatedly, in ways nobody predicted or prepared for. We survived not because of our systems, but despite them. The margin between civilization and extinction proved to be far thinner than anyone imagined. Sometimes just a technician noticing a radar track was wrong, sometimes just an officer trusting intuition over computers. Sometimes just a rocket happening to fly a slightly different trajectory than a missile would. We're still here, but we're here largely by accident. The real question isn't why the Cold War's nuclear weapons didn't destroy us. It's why we're still maintaining thousands of weapons on high alert status. Still trusting that we'll be lucky again. Still playing Russian roulette with civilization and hoping the chamber comes up empty one more time.